of our Earth and its people as resources, some kind of an intelligent choice mechanism as a means of status, based on a global concept of justice, and try to remove ourselves from a point of reference. In other words, simply speaking, do I really need to buy that thing? Am I really that important? We can't really change what happens in our environment if we keep needing as many things as we think we do need. Someone else mentioned time. I think it was Mr. Doyle from Cominco, given enough time and technical ability. I think that's probably true. Cominco could, given enough time, do many wonderful things to clean up the environment, and they certainly have in the past. However, I submit that I don't have the time to give him. I can't make that time. Time is a universal thing. Somehow we have to learn to do it, knowing that we don't know how much time we have left. Also, I don't necessarily represent all of my fellow students, my points of view. Thank you.
Okay, Peter? Yeah.
I conclude it's true. It's definitely in vogue to criticize civil servants these days. And part of it's justified and part of it isn't. I agree also with Mr. Geist that their planning per se is not a panacea in terms of a solution or anything. But I think we must regard the fact that in this global community there are two kinds of planning that is going on. And there are two kinds of planners, basically. There are planners who are involved in global management. And the participants of global management are basically those involved in multinational or transnational corporations that operate on this planet. The other kind of planner which occurs are planners occurring within a national framework, all the way down to local or regional districts. So we have planners on the global scale, and we have planners on, relatively speaking, the small scale. And this, to my view, is the problem that's occurring. Who should decide? Should it be decisions based on global priorities, or should there be decisions made by whom on local priorities? And that's a very important question, and I addressed that question to Mr. Geist and also to Mr. Doyle, who is a representative of Cominco, and I definitely contend that Cominco is not a pragmatic and enlightened corporation in view of some of their practices in South Africa, and I would really be interested to hear about his approach there. Thank you.
I'm sorry, but did you mention South Africa? To my knowledge, we have no interest in South Africa. In Southern Africa. I think we had a place in Sked and we got out with our tail between our legs because somebody like Amin was doing a sort of a jig on the severed heads of all of his political opposition. I'm sorry, I was so angry about the first one, I forgot the other one.
Moya, would you like to?
Oh, well, I just wanted to say something about planning. It sounds very glorious, working out all these plans, but there's not much point unless you have a government that is going to implement them. I can think of several examples in the last few months when there have been. Sorry, is that better? I can think of a few examples in the last few months when plans that have taken the civil service plus the public a great deal of work have gone to Victoria and also to Ottawa, and the government feels it's done its thing, it's asked for public participation, but the plans have never been made public and they have just sat there on a shelf. The same with an awful lot of royal commissions in this country. So I think maybe once some kind of plan or report or public participation has taken place, people shouldn't sit back and just think that they have accomplished something. They should make sure that, for one thing, the plan is made public, and also give the government a few shoves now and again to see if something is going to be done with all that information.
Are you suggesting then that the minister responsible for forestry recently has done a tremendous disservice to the professional foresters of this province by suggesting that they shouldn't really discuss the Pierce report so that the public could go to the best informed people to get better information, and possibly the Minister of Highways should issue the report that was prepared for the Gerard or the possibility of a Gerard Bridge up at the end of Trout Lake?
Well, in the specific instance of Gerard, I think it's quite absurd that somebody is commissioned to undertake a public inquiry and have hearings all over the province and spend a lot of time putting together an analysis of public opinion, and then it's never made public in the end. The same way, all I would say about the Pierce report is, let's see in a few years whether any of the recommendations are implemented, or if it just ends up as a glorious discussion that leaves us right where we started.
Put Mr. Doyle on the spot. I'm Norman Polster, but he mentioned 96.6%. And I'd like to just talk about that for a moment, if I may. First of all, we'd better look at our standards. I became concerned about standards about 35 years ago. And the first time I bumped into them where it was sort of critical was with fallout matters, when they were talking about iodine-131 being kept out of children's thyroids so that it wouldn't exceed 5 times background radiation for a year. In the Dryden Chemical Company, they were allowed to put out 0.005 pounds of mercury into the environment per ton of chlorine they produced. The BC Hydro is now allowed to cause static on our radio reception to the extent that it doesn't interfere with a 500 microvolt local signal, radio signal. It seems to me that what we have to do is, and I might just come back to Cominco. When I first began teaching in Argenta, we visited Cominco, and I looked at a book called Beautiful British Columbia, I think it was, and they talked about how Cominco was sued because of their release of sulfur across the border, and how now, instead of putting out, I don't know, tons maybe it was of sulfur at that time, they were now only putting out 20% of the amount of sulfur they produced. They got into the chemical, the fertilizer business. Well, the 20% doesn't really tell you anything, because what has Cominco increased in its production since the time that they were putting out the tons of chlorine that the 20% represents? What we have to do is look back at not the magnitude of things in either percentage or amounts, but what is it in terms of a health hazard? And this is one of the things that neither the Dryden Chemical Company, Cominco, or Mr. Doyle now has spoken to. And I think we have to talk about the relativeness of amounts of effluents released in the environment to the health on the individual that might be involved in it.
Yeah, I think we have to talk about the relativeness of some other things. If I could bring you back to the microphone, Norman, for a while, I'd like to ask you and put you on the spot for a moment.
Surely.
What are you doing as far as environmental education in your classroom?
Well, I taught a course last year called QUEST, Quantitative Understanding Essential for Sane Thinking. Now, that particular thing doesn't mean very much to many of you, but in the course in 11th grade algebra, none of the high school algebra text had anything to do about exponential growth, had nothing to do with mortgages. When the Simpson-Sears now charges 21% on their unpaid balance, that amount is growing at 1.75 divided into 70, or every 40 months. Now, to me, this growth concept, which we have in our what I call fictitious measure of wealth, money, is what's dividing people up. In other words, you've got people who are taking away from other people in such awful proportions that we're going to end up with a bunch of poor people and a few rich people. And all the real wealth, the energy, the resources, the information, the knowledge, is going to be in the hands of a few. And we shouldn't allow that. This is where I think that we're all mixed up. So that in that sense, I have been teaching this sort of concept in my algebra teaching. I taught a course 10 years ago when we visited Kootenay, called Science for a Livable World. I'm now an inventor. I've made an engine which isn't going to pollute anything. It's going to use electricity for its source of power. I'm going to be talking about that tonight at the Amateur Radio Club, their annual meeting tonight. That's why I'm in Nelson today. So I have been trying to do things I can for the environment as far as pollution is concerned.
Okay. I'm not saying other discussions aren't relevant, but I'd like to keep away from straight technical items.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think I can just respond briefly on the technicalities. The 96.6%, of course, is a nice figure, but in terms of absolutes, during the period since the decision of the International Joint Tribunal, the trail case they called it, since that time there were two regimes imposed on ambient air quality, which was measured at the border, and on a continuous basis a monitoring of the ambient air quality at Juanita has been maintained over many years, and during the growing season it was 0.03 parts per million of SO2, which is certainly well within the sort of federal guidelines for ambient air for SO2, and during the non-growing season for a number of years it was 0.05. Now, since the implementation of the objectives of the provincial Environmental Control Act, this regime has been, since last year, modified so that the lower limit prevails all year round. So regardless of the percentage of fixation, there is still an overriding ambient quality which is actually the controlling factor. And if this is exceeded, then production is cut back, and if necessary, production is totally cut back to a complete shutdown.
All I was trying to say was that the amount that, whatever numbers you give out, it should relate to human health, not just to percent of your production or something like that, because 0.005 pounds of mercury put into the environment to a small Wibigoon river system up in Ontario is damaging to the Indians in that area, who depend upon the fish for their livelihood. Now, it has nothing to do with the production of chlorine by the Dryden Chemical Company, yet the standard is based on their production of chemicals. So I just say that in a general way, you've got to look at health matters and not just on production matters.
Well, I agree with you entirely. I think epidemiological standards are quite obviously the overriding factor, and for this reason, I honestly believe the federal health and welfare department simply are fiddling around. They spend very little money on epidemiological studies, which they should be spending, and they make the most incredible artificial standards predicated on information which they simply don't have. And if industry could get the sort of guidelines which were predicated on epidemiological results, we would be delighted to comply with them.
Okay. I think here, we're dealing with problems as they are. I think we should move along to consider what could be. Bill?
Okay. There were some pretty strong statements made about what children should teach by what should they learn, and who should tell them what we should teach as a prospective teacher. I'm well drilled in all this philosophy of education. I had a beautiful platonic series of questions to trick you into answering the way I wanted, but I don't want to do that anymore. I just want to ask you, what do you think of environmental education schools and how it should be taught, or if it should be taught?
Yes, I think they should be taught very definitely the basic sciences. They should be taught the facts of how a leaf works, of what happens in certain chemical changes. They should have all these bases, which really is what the core curriculum is talking about, to give them that information. When they have that information, they're able to make decisions on their own part. They do not necessarily need other people to put those decisions in their heads.
Now, that's acceptable. Now, in a changing world, the core curriculum would change a little bit. So, don't you feel environmental concerns as just the effect of certain industrial usage studs to an area, so that children so they can make their own choice? Or would you just teach them that, as you say, how a leaf grows? Or would you use examples that exist in our community that as examples of good and bad environmental usage? And so therefore, when they grew up, they would have the proper perspective and background to make a choice, whatever the choice may be, maybe not the choice of the teacher. So you seem to be limiting what we should teach our children. But in the core curriculum, as it develops throughout Western educational theory, it's always changed to accept what's relevant in the society of the moment.
I'm going to come to a support here in the sense, what is relevant?
I'm asking, okay, what is relevant? You're on the panel. I could tell you what is relevant. We're here to try to decide. The question of the panel, I believe, was how we can work together to promote environmental education. So, being members of the panel, I direct my question to anybody in the panel. How can we work together and what can we do?
Well, to carry it further, if you have a basis in fact and information, and you develop a mind that can think, take this information, weigh it, assess it, and then come up with a decision, haven't you done all that you can for the person? I think I heard Dr. Hartman say that Val Geist had come a long way, and I've heard Val Geist speak on numerous occasions, and each time I'm impressed by what that man has learned because of his ability to separate fact and fiction, and I'm sure that he has a lot of people in here that will agree with him. I'm sure he has an equal number that will disagree with him or not understand or appreciate what he's trying to convey. And I think that it's all levels of understanding and appreciation that we have to come to, and not all of us are as capable of doing all the things that we may wish to do. But if we keep striving and base it on sincerity, honesty, and the best we can get, we're doing the best we can. And sometimes it's not very good, even in the core curriculum.
Okay.
I'd just like to suggest something very, very practical that maybe you could do is explain to your students, give them maybe just a very, very brief guidebook maybe on the government departments. I'm constantly astonished and saddened at the people who suddenly find themselves with an environmental problem and they haven't the faintest idea which government department to go to. They don't know which agency looks after what, federally and provincially, and sometimes people can spend months going around in circles before they end up in the right direction, and that's something very simple and very practical that would help people tremendously when they graduate and maybe get involved in some kind of organization.
Well, I agree with Moira. I'm not an educator, of course. I'm a lawyer, and I'm used to fighting battles in the courts, so I don't know much about education, but I know that fighting battles in the courts is not the most important thing in environmental management problems. I think education is. But I think that one of the big problems in environmental education, at least in our secondary school system as I understand it, is that we're now beginning to sensitize our students to these questions of limited resources and the importance of preserving wilderness areas. We're starting to teach them practical wilderness survival skills, but I'm sorry to say that I don't think we're teaching them much about how to preserve them or what to do practically, as Moira says, when the problem comes to their doorstep. The students that are leaving our secondary schools regard the establishment with frustration and apathy and ignorance. They don't know which government departments are responsible for the administration of which laws. They don't know which laws are even in effect on the books, and they don't know how to participate in the political process, let alone participating in the law reform process or the process of law enforcement.
Okay. Dr. Thayer, do you want? Well, take you next. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd just like to question the educators on some rather more practical aspects of the environmental education program, how it's going to be put into effect. There's been a lot of discussion about the environmental education from the point of view of cultivating an ethic, which is, of course, an important thing to start from. But on the other hand, there's got to be more to environmental education than things like looking at pretty pictures of scenery and deer and saying, well, we've just got to preserve this, haven't we? Now, I was wondering, is there going to be a place in environmental education for some of the more traditional academic disciplines, like some of the sciences, not just biology, but the other sciences too, possibly the humanities, so that people will be able to understand what the technologists are talking about? And can this be integrated into the program, or is it going to be sort of kept in a separate section? Can I hear some of the educators' point of view on that?
I can try, but I won't give you any answer because I don't think any firm policy has been established provincially or locally. And I think this is the opportunity that the public has with the discussion of the core curriculum, and this can be a part of the core. Now, all of what you've mentioned with regard to environmental education is basically science. It can be a part of core, and the way that it comes about is entirely up to the people and the way they direct the government to place it or implement it. I think that a lot of people may not be aware that the core curriculum, what they have placed out in front of you, are broad goals at the present time. The goals are very, very broad. They're either motherhood or fatherhood, and then you're not accused of being one way or the other. But they're apple pie. There isn't one goal that's listed in there that is objectionable. They're all good. But I think you have to make sure that you feed into the system what you want done. And if it's reading, writing, and arithmetic only, that's what's going to be there. If you say that there has to be better science, that's what it has to be. The natural sciences that used to be there are not there currently. We had a Sputnik barrage a while ago, and we got little packages and kits that came in and out that nobody could keep tabs of over the last 5 years. And right now, the science that's generally in the elementary school is a pretty poor quality, by and large.
It's up to you. Okay. We've got two. Okay. You've got the microphone now.
Said hi. Should have touched it. I feel rather foolish speaking. I'm a mother and I'm also studying to be a teacher, and I think that the environmental conference here at NDU is really an important thing and should happen everywhere, more and more now. as a mother, I'm deeply, deeply, from my very heart, concerned about my children. I'm frightened. I'm truly frightened, and I'm not being dramatic. I think that we all come to these things, and we learn a lot. We have professional opinions and facts and all points of view, and I always feel that everybody's a bit wrapped up in their own world, that somehow I feel frustrated that there's never a breakthrough from our hearts. And I feel kind of that it would be wonderful if we could all go away from these things more on fire, feeling a burning, somehow inspired to do something, if only in our own lives, a point to change our point of understanding, to not get so wrapped up on so many petty little things. I'm sure in our hearts we're all together. And I don't really know what else to say except that's how I feel, and I hope that somehow everyone could burn a bit, could leave the conference, and that somehow that this conference here, that something more for us, that we could continue it in something more vital, functional to our lives, can come out of all this from our hearts, alive.
I'd like to comment on what my fellow student said. I'm scared too. I came from a school system that taught me how a leaf functioned. What it didn't bother teaching me was how I could make that leaf stop functioning. I watched my father do it. He sprayed DDT on the vegetable plants that I ate. Of course, he used it right. He waited until the right time, and then he sprayed only a certain amount, and I made it to this age. He also taught me about bees and things like that, but he never made the connection about what happens to these bugs that eat these leaves, that I know how they function, and the birds who eat those bugs, and so on and so forth. So I learned how it worked, but I didn't learn how it doesn't work. I thought I grew up learning to be an intelligent consumer. I had Consumer Report magazine, and so one day, when there was a sale on electric toothbrushes, I checked my magazine and I bought the best bargain I could find. Not only that, but I used it because my dentist told me that this was the best thing I could do for my gums, and he was right. I didn't have nearly as many cavities. But I never made the connection between that plastic toothbrush that I plug into the wall and the environment. So when someone tells me that I should teach a child how a leaf functions, I would say that's only the beginning. I want to know what makes it stop. I want my kids to know.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond a little bit. There is always the danger, of course, when we are being realistic and looking at what we are surrounded with, that we become pessimists, and we'd be silly to just be optimists. But some things have happened. Whoever would have thought that Quebec would have a negative birth rate a few years ago? The pelicans, which were almost obliterated off the shores of Southern California by DDT, have shown a recovery. Now we have other problems, PBB seeping into the environment and being recycled through feeds when contaminated animals are recycled as food and such, and a thing that's spreading. And I wonder if the American broiler chickens that are on sale in Super Value in Vancouver today are not perhaps on sale because of that. But we have to do this. I'd just like to say that politicians talk about these things. Dave Barrett, certainly, if you get him alone and you really face him with that question, what does he see in the future? He's not a cockeyed optimist, but but also you have to keep going ahead. And I'm sure that people have felt like this in the past. We certainly think about these things. We have children ourselves. And as a teacher, though, as a former teacher, and now I'm more of a parent, I think, I'd like to touch on what we should be teaching. You know, we really have to start teaching exponential growth, not just as a mathematical function, but giving examples of exponential growth. For instance, BC Hydro, at the rate at which BC Hydro debt has increased since it became BC Hydro in 1963, I have extrapolated that it fits the exponential model and will have an indebtedness of $128 billion by the year 1999. Now, these are the kinds of examples we have to come to grips with, and we're dealing with little symptoms. The Skagit is a symptom. It's a small thing. It's very important symbolically. The Valhalla is not the end of the world, but if we don't act collectively on these things, and if we don't bring about an awareness with the pupils that we're teaching and with the teachers that are teaching, we certainly will be in a great deal of trouble because we have to react very, very quickly to the situation we're in. But a few things have happened. The birth rate, whoever would have thought it, in Quebec has gone down. Pelicans are coming back in some areas where they were almost obliterated. And so I think we'll have to keep looking at both aspects of these things, not just...
Mr. Hatch, I wonder if I could thank you for your comments today. You've given terrific encouragement to many people here. Some of us wonder whether or not we're doing much good or not. And I think that your comments about organized groups and citizens and the fact that we're finally getting through to you has really done something for the people here and for the teaching of environmental education. I think for too long governments and industry have used the principle of divide and conquer very, very successfully. And now that we know that we're beginning to make progress, you've certainly done a lot for us. Thank you.
We have publicly requested public input long before the groups were organized. As a matter of fact, the Valhallas really blew up when we attended a public meeting and gave a 12-year plan at that meeting, which stated specifically where we plan to log and when we plan to do it, and what some of our concerns were. So there's always been, as long as I've been with this company, the feeling that we are interested in what the public has had to say. We've welcomed people to come into the office to discuss any of the problems. We welcome just downright discussion on wood utilization, what our plans are. Everything's been open and above board to date.
I'll leave the last for the best, or the best for the last. But at any rate, there is no reason for pessimism. There's every reason that we can be optimistic. Just look around the room. All kinds of people here who've given up their Saturdays to study about environmental education. What we learn from this hasn't anything to do with the trivialities that Dr. Geist mentioned. It isn't a beautiful sunset or the birds and the bees. We learn the lessons that we can apply to our own lives. What we're interested in is the human environment, that there are differences, and that we accommodate the differences, and that we conserve human energy and human resources, and that we don't waste children's time, and that the curriculum is life, and that life doesn't begin at 3:30 for children, that it's going on in the classroom. There's some serious implications for the classroom teacher that grow out of environmental education. That what's relevant is what's going on. The core curriculum is important. I think that we need to know definitively what the basics are, but it's just the beginning. By employing the principles that we learned from environmental education and making them operable in the classroom, we will ensure that the children will learn those basic kinds of things. We need to get the message from the people back to the basics. We need to, take it seriously. But let's not forget that back to the basics, for people who were educated even a few short years ago, is a very limited concept of what education has to be. Even among you people here, and some of you are very young, you are not with the children because they're in the future. And change is so rapid that you see, this is what we're thinking about. What do we learn from environment so that our children can carry it into the future? It's very difficult for us who've been educated in the past to know how to deal with the future. And that's the task. We learn a lot from environmental education. In a way, our roles have changed. And I'm not talking about just teachers as educators, but I'm talking about parents as well. Not too long ago, our job was simply to transmit knowledge, to pass on what our mothers did and what our fathers did and what our teacher did. But the role has changed. The role is for the basic people at the grassroots to initiate change. Now we're all concerned with, it's been a marvelous conference. We've learned a great deal. Where do we start? What do we do? That's what we're all concerned with. From listening to everyone, we found out the government is powerless, industry, scientists can do very little without us, with the people working right with everyone. And so this is what we must concern ourselves with. What are we going to do with the children in the schools so that they listen to the messages they've been getting? Indeed, what are we going to do with the teachers in the schools so they will listen to all the information that's available? Now that's what we have to think about when we go out. Well, as a starter, we've learned from this conference in a really special kind of a way that it isn't the problems that handicap us, but it's our approach to problem solving. Now, in schools, what do we do when we have a problem? We call in a reading teacher, or the principal, or a psychologist, or we tell the child to go home and do his homework at home. Suppose the classroom became a laboratory for solving the problems in that classroom. The grade 2 teacher that I know had the idea of having the children read 20 books in a month. And one boy wasn't doing it. So she said to the class, we have a problem. John isn't reading his 20 books. What will we do about it? And the children said, we will help John to read the 20 books. Now that's a very simple example of how we can begin to solve problems within ourselves. There's, maybe this doesn't happen to you, but don't married couples have countless opportunities to solve problems? You might be one of these men who solves it by saying, yes, dear, you're right. And maybe that works for you. But within our own lives, we can change our approaches to problem solving. Because in the foreseeable future, we're going to have problems and lots of them. And that's what we want to equip our children to do. Look at a situation, see all the angles and facets and factors that are involved. Get all the knowledge that you can. Be open, to the wisdom that people have accumulated through years of study. And then with that, how do we go about solving our problem? This has been a very exciting experience for me to see so many people interested. It's true, a great many more could have come. But just think, If each one of us goes out and as a result of this conference touch in some way the lives of 5 people, pass on the information. Yes. Have you got your hand up? Yes, I am.
There's a couple of points I should like to make. Firstly, I'd like to agree with something our legal friend on the platform said a few moments ago, that one of the greatest failures, as far as I can see, in the educational system is that we get students coming out of our schools at all levels, including universities, that have no idea as to, one, what their rights are, but even if they do know that, have very little information or experience by that stage as to how to go about claiming them or defending them, whether it's in the environmental sphere or almost any other. Our schools have failed on that, and as far as I'm aware, are still failing very drastically. And we may have all the knowledge in the world about what's wrong and what should be right, but unless we have some training and some disciplining in as to how to achieve action once we decide what our goals are, we aren't going to get any very far with all the discussions and all the conferences in the world. One of the other problems that I see often in terms of education regarding the environment is that we give so much emphasis to controlling individual needs and wants, and suggesting that the answer is not to litter, or we go into the park, don't step on a bug, or whatever it happens to be. But there's, the individual is subject to all kinds of influences. And when you have a society in which, for instance, our entire taxation system, at least the part of our taxation structure across Canada that deals with the primary business of our society, has built-in incentives to increase productive capacity, whether that productive capacity is needed or not. And right now we're underusing the productive capacity of Canada, and still we dole out millions and millions of dollars as incentives to produce more factories where we don't use the ones we've got now. That we build office towers that are used for only 8 hours a day, use up some of the most valuable real estate in our major metropolitan areas. We design our whole tax system, our whole business system on waste and creating more waste, and in creating needs amongst the public that the public had never realized they had. We also have a taxation system which, in terms of advertising, gives a bonus to demand creation advertising. You claim that as a cost against your business. Now, surely we should begin to think of revising our taxation laws that at least neutralize whatever expenses above a certain level which can be legitimate product knowledge advertising. To at least not allow businesses to write off as expenses demand creation advertising. In fact, we might even go a step further and regard that as income, because that's the purpose of it, is to increase the income of that corporation at public expense. But until we begin to take a view of society which is a lot more important, what we can do collectively, instead of placing as much blame as we seem to, and especially in the elementary schools where you've got young kids, and that's where we always seem to say, it's your fault, Johnny, if you leave your litter around. That's when they're most impressionable, and if we leave them that impression when they're growing up, they're never going to take much of a broad view of things as they get older. The one other thing that I think we have to attempt to get at, again within our school system and in the public at large, is that there is no such thing as a public interest. In Walter Lippmann's Public Philosophy, or anything else you want to read on the subject, the public interest is the prevailing private interest. We all have, there's 300 people here, there's 300 public interests in this room. So we form coalitions, we form groups, we form organizations or parties or whatever you want to call. We attempt to compromise with each other and come up with consensus of a majority, if not everyone. And the private interest which contends and which wins, which has the prevailing power at the time, is the public interest. And there's no such shibboleth, no matter how many editorial writers quote it. Until our children realize that and begin to realize the world is what it is and not what a lot of dreamers would like to pretend, we're not going to come to our grips with our problem, and attending conferences will be no more than attending church on Sunday in terms of having a concrete effect on the society around us.
May I speak? I'm a teacher, or have been, and a minor, but primarily I'm a parent. And I agree with what the previous speaker just said, and I just like to comment on this core curriculum and what we have said here today. I agree that the child should be made to think, or taught to think. I think that he should be made aware of the environmental problems. All these are truths. But you, as teachers, we must be very, very careful that we don't teach our bias or our political philosophy, because this is what is happening in the province today, and this is where the polarization is coming. And for myself, for somebody else to teach his political philosophy or his particular bias to the exclusion of all else, those 5 children of mine are the most important thing in my life to me. There's going to be trouble. So, thank you.
Well, one way that I see the situation today is that mankind is responsible for the environment and for stewarding the environment. But it appears to me that this stewarding has primarily been carried out in economic self-interest terms. We can all, any interest can take advantage of economic self-interest within a given definition. You can promote the fish, the trout, in the north end of the Kootenay Lake. From a self-interest point, you can promote the Valhallas, you can promote the forest industry. Any management of the environment, whether, no matter what side, seems to me primarily still being carried out from an economic point of view. Now, that's simply a matter of definition of economics. But I think if one goes back to the original outgrowth of the economics in the Greek, both the word ecology and economics coming from the same point, or at least a merger here, I think one can understand the challenge, in my mind, that's before humanity today, to act no longer from an economic self-interest point, but in the name of larger systems. That we are being asked not to simply preserve the gene pool from a selfish point of view. I don't fish, but I care dearly also about the trout in the north end of the lake. Now, it's not a selfish interest point. It is going into another sort of management that I think we are all beginning to discover inside each of us. And then you have, I think, this challenge being put on us to act then politically, economically, socially, in the name of larger systems to preserve this gene pool. The question I would put before the panel is if they would care to comment about managing the gene pool, the population, and preserving this great diversity solely in terms of economic terms as we understand economics today, or do you feel it is important to establish a new definition of economics or a greater consciousness of management?
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I'd like to go back to something that Lyle Kristiansen said too, and that is he mentioned taxation, and some people might wonder what would taxation have to do with the environment. I'd like to just relate the taxation system on property. Instead of having property taxation for municipal government in in the Scandinavian countries, and I think indeed in most of Europe, they have a system of personal income tax. And just as an example of the impact on environment, in Helsinki, Finland, they are getting rid of industries in the core of the city and bringing in housing and creating residential development in order to attract the income from personal income tax, because there is no revenue to be gained by having a plant with a large property tax assessment in your area. It is there to, so their incentive is to bring a population and people into the city because this is their reward. So it's certainly, taxation policy can be a very important policy in terms of determining the nature of an environment and the nature of urban environment in particular. Mr. Holloway's comments, I would just like to say that I totally agree with them. We're really talking in Gerard Creek issue about 600 trout on the face of this earth, because that's all there are. Well, there are the ones that have been transplanted to other lakes and have adapted there quite well. But that is how important that is. And it is like lining up a harpoon on the last whale in the ocean or something else. And this is something that it is very difficult for persons like Bill King and myself who represent this area to make felt and understood in Victoria in real terms with other people who, I think, if they could see it that way, would certainly not look at it in economic dollars and cents terms as to how much it will cost to build a road around the west side of a lake or as opposed to a Bailey Bridge. And we do have to start making decisions that way. If we see the last of the mountain caribou, we easily have it within our grasp to obliterate all mountain sheep in North America. And if we do this, our existence will be that much diminished, and as man, we'll be that much smaller and more insignificant. So I just say that I really ascribe to those values. I must say that I have also been faced with having to make some of the compromises. However, in terms of dollars and cents, fortunately, really, in terms of dollars and cents, we can justify the existence of the Gerard trout economically, and that's perhaps a fortunate fact.
Excuse me. The question was raised, in essence, whether we have to change our economic system in order to ensure the continuing existence of a very complex living world around us. I only briefly would like to address myself to this, and I'm a perfect pessimist when it comes to revolution. A perfect pessimist. I don't know of any revolution at the present time that attempted to achieve its goals after you have examined it a few years, decades down the line. I am, however, an optimist in evolution. Evolution of social systems, economic systems, just as much as of living systems. And since I am an optimist along this line, I can only suggest the following. Oh, just to make one point clear. Although I am most unhappy about many aspects of the socio-economic system that we are presently captives of, I at the same time recognize that it has certain attributes within it that are superior to any other economic system that today exists on the earth. That puts one into a very peculiar situation. You can't condemn it outright. You can't fall in love with it either. But you can ask yourselves what aspects of it are worthy of preservation and what aspects are not. And I'm suggesting that the only way we can ensure at the present time both the valuable aspects of the economic system we happen to have as well of the natural environment is in fact to impose constraints on that economic system. It won't kill the economic system. It's a very viable and very virile beast. And the constraints, of course, come via values that we treasure, and which we simply will say so far and no further economic system. You may not transgress, and some of these values have been suggested. And these, of course, at the local level, reveal themselves as concern for a mountain caribou herd, for a mountain sheep herd, concerns for a grizzly bear population, concerns for a valley, and so on and so forth. In order to have, however, these values, we must have knowledge, and we must have a very wide knowledge about the systems that exist around us, and I don't mean only the natural system. It means also knowledge about how the very socioeconomic system and political system that we are in exist. And without the slightest doubt, this is something that I have not been taught well in school. I don't know about others, but I certainly learned a lot about it later on. I don't know if it can be taught in school entirely. Maybe a beginning can be made, because our socioeconomic and political systems are enormously complex, and you can spend a lifetime examining just a small fraction of it. That sets a few priorities as far as our teaching is concerned, in my opinion. Two other priorities are, and this is crystal clear, you have to develop ability to comprehend, to handle facts, to examine, to think. Our school systems have a responsibility here. But at the same time, let me stress something as well. When you start putting on constraints onto any system, you tend to think frequently in negative terms. And it is useful to go off and think about something positive as well. Now, when we're speaking about health and negative things, then you can pick up a textbook in environmental health today. There is a collection of don'ts. We teach those people that are specialists in environmental health essentially all the mistakes that we have done in the past and how to cope with these mistakes. We don't teach them how to anticipate mistakes. If you teach somebody to anticipate mistakes, he's starting to think in a positive term. And I'm suggesting that one of the most positive terms to think about, and that our students ought to be familiar with, is to try to answer simply the question, how to live healthy. It's a simple question. Ladies and gentlemen, there are no simple answers in it at all. And by the time you start thinking from that perspective, in no time flat you're across the globe and into all sorts of complexities and different shades of complexions of various opinions, systems, whatever you care to look at. If we can address ourselves to that question, we can in fact go a rather long ways. There were many points raised here, absolutely fascinating points, and it's perfectly clear we are aware of the complexities that we're situated in, and we're equally aware that no easy answers can be forthcoming on any one of them.
Mr. Chairman, I know the wine and cheese are calling, and I'll be very brief. I'm Gordon Petter, and I've been teaching and working in this place for the last 12 years. The continuing question I've heard here this afternoon from so many angles is, what, if anything, can anybody do? Well, I think there's one thing that everybody in this conference can do, and do right away. The most fragile environment with which we're concerned at the moment is the place in which you're sitting, the place in which this conference is being convened. And if you think that this kind of activity is of any value in this part of the world, then I would recommend that every person in this conference should go out and take some kind of action, yes, political action, because this university is being closed down at the end of May. It's finished, it's washed up, and a complacent government in Victoria have given absolutely no assurance that there'll be anything to replace it. And to the people who have been concerned in this place, I don't mean people only teaching, but people who have come to conferences like this, to all kinds of other activities, this seems to be the moment when political action, that's action by concerned individuals, writing, cabling, whatever way they think best, to Victoria, that this place should not be allowed to die, that this kind of action should be taken at once. It's beautiful sitting on the Titanic and discussing the ecology of fishes, but We're going to be sunk within half an hour. Let's do something about it.
On behalf of the students, Dr. Petter, thank you very much. Kevin, one last question, I think, unless there's anyone else who's really wanting.
I don't want to be unreasonable by saying a last word, but I'm glad that I do have this last word, and that's I've been sitting here for a couple days being very reasonable, listening to bigger brains be very reasonable, and attempting to reach a reasonable synthesis. And I teach grade 4, and in my desk I've got a folder that I haven't used yet. It's a picture of some crippled children in Japan, and there's some pictures of some brain-destroyed children in Michigan, and there's some pictures of My Lai children massacred, and these have been done by very reasonable people. These deeds have been done by very reasonable people. And I'm finding it hard to suppress some very primitive emotions regarding what I would do if somebody did that to my child. Some very reasonable chemical engineer, some very reasonable general destroyed the life of my child, or many other children, and I don't know what you say, where you go after you're unreasonable, but I'm really getting tired of being reasonable, and I think a lot of people are. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the chemical engineers, I won't express the primitive emotions, but it's happening things are being done by reasonable people that aren't very reasonable, and I'm really tired of it, and I don't know exactly what to do about it. But like I said, I wouldn't know how to react. I don't think I could control these emotions if some reasonable person does something unreasonable to my son.
If I could just make
Keep it very brief,
comment.
please.
This whole conference is centered around external ecology, all that ecology outside. And I think what a lot of people have been trying to get at is the ecology inside your mind. And one example is this hostility that could break out within our whole country because of all these things that are going to come down on us in a very short time and have been coming down. And therefore the ecology of the mind is becoming more and more important as a field of well, that's not right. Okay, the ecology of the mind is an area which is becoming increasingly more important than the ecology of the external environment. And I think as educators, the main thing that you can stress now is not so much that external environment as centering on the internal environment. And the internal environment is a very complex ecosystem. Inside a person is not only emotions, intellect, spirituality. There's all sorts of interrelations between things that are going on inside the mind. And
also, something that's going to become increasingly more important is morals. How can you teach morals to children? This problem is...
The problem is, of course, very many-sided, but basically what it comes down to is care for each other, and that is something that has not been happening in the world. Otherwise our ecosystems would not be breaking down. So therefore I would say basically care for each other is going to become more important than any kind of planning which is going on, any kind of organization which can be publicized. It's going to come down to care for each other. That's all I have to say.
Okay. One more. Okay, Bob.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest something that the human posterior has a certain limitation on its ability to withstand stress. And I think that I would like to thank personally all the members of the panel. I think there's been a lot of honesty displayed. And I think perhaps we have proved that communication between media, industry, education, so on, that this communication needs to be improved because we are all individuals with different points of view, but possibly we're all just a bit right. And we probably definitely have environmental problems of one kind or another. Certainly we have a finite planet, and we have the capability of producing an infinite number of people if the planet will withstand it. And certainly we have problems of ever-increasing gross national product on the finite planet. But I think we need to endeavor to obtain a climate in which we can communicate without hostility. I think that there have been edges of hostility displayed today, but that they have been remarkably well curbed. And possibly a direction that we all need work in is to enable ourselves in some way or another to really communicate and really study the problems. For example, possibly we need to start at the point, do we even have an environmental problem? If we prove that to ourselves, then we need to examine the nature of the problem. Now, I don't want to go on endlessly here. I think that this has been a good thing. Even the friction has been good. I think that we all have to remember, perhaps, that in that very, very broad sense of the word, we need love one another or have tolerance for one another. And I think we need to recognize that we all have biases, and that the biases are educated into us. And perhaps there is something to the concept of some kind of a holistic form of education which has not yet arrived. And so I'll turn it back to you, John, but I do want to thank everyone because I am more or less at the bottom of the organization of this, along with some of the students who have worked very hard. I would like to thank all of the people on my behalf and on behalf of the university, and so it's all yours there for a moment, John.
Got nothing to add. Be wine and cheese downstairs now.